I'm Anita Stewart. I write under AF Stewart. I write fantasy and horror, and of course steampunk. And I often throw the fantasy and horror into the steampunk, just for fun. Most of my steampunk to date have been short stories, but I do have a couple of steampunk novels in the works, not yet published, but hopefully soon.
My name is SHERIDAN Rose, and I write a lot of things, but my favorite and most to date is the Conman Chronicles, which is a 5-book series so far with a first-person narrator. I just, for NaNoWriMo, wrote a book that will be a second series set in the same world. So we'll see how that works out.
Hi, my name is Madeline Holly Rosing. I am the writer-creator of the Steampunk Supernatural series Boston Metaphysical Society, which is graphic novels, and short stories and novellas.
Hi, I'm LOUISE. I'm the author of the Tales of Sage and Savant, which is both a full scripted audio drama podcast and a series of novels. Book 1 of the novels is out now. Book 2 is in process, and I'm currently writing book 3 to go along with the show.
Hello, I'm Alex McGilvery. I write, like the rest of you, in a wide variety of genres. My steampunk series is Calliope and the Sea Serpent, and Royal Engineers, etc. And it's I've sort of said it at the beginning of the steampunk era, when a lot of the stuff is being invented and created. So it's I'm having lots of fun trying to figure out how to arrive at some of these fantastical things that we have with the steampunk genre, and make it work in the world that I've built.
Steampunk is a subgenre of science fiction or science fantasy that incorporates technology and aesthetic designs inspired by 19th century industrial steam-powered machinery. Although its literary origins are sometimes associated with the cyberpunk genre, steampunk works are often set in alternative histories of the 19th century, British Victorian era, or American Wild West, in a future during which steam power has maintained mainstream usage, or in a fantasy world that similarly employs steam power.
That description, I would say yes and no. I think that's what steampunk started out to be, but it has since evolved into something much more. It is no longer limited to Victorian England or the American West. You see a lot of multicultural steampunk out there, looking at Africa and Asia and all over the world, that takes, I wouldn't say so much a steampunk approach, but an alternate history approach. And I often refer to my own work first as more alternate history than steampunk.
Yeah, I agree with that, because you see a lot of Asian themed steampunk, and my current work in progress for steampunk is set in Canada, so you're going to get Canadian steampunk one of these days, hopefully. Anyway, so the best definition I ever heard for steampunk was it's history that never was.
Nice.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
So And I think that one of the unique things about the steampunk genre, especially as it's developed, is it allows us to take a look at divergent points in history and then choose a different way. So electricity has been folded into steampunk, not because electricity was always created by steam power, but because we're all fascinated with Tesla and Edison. And we all know the big showdown there was in AC or DC power and what was going to happen. And Tesla was already working on wireless energy. So what if you just took the alternate that he won that showdown instead of Edison, and his ideas came to the forefront and he got to develop that wireless energy? Then how different would our world be? The thing about steampunk for me is that it's always about that sort of modern era hopefulness. There was a time in what's known as the modern era, which is, you know, late industrial revolution up to the 2 world wars, where we really thought that man could solve every problem. We had hope that ideas could fix everything that was wrong in the world, and inventors were hailed as heroes because they were inventing those things that would solve the problems of the world. And that's a big factor in steampunk, whether it's on another planet or in a different dimension. Steampunk is always focusing on that hope that inventions can somehow fix problems.
My latest steampunk book is actually set in a fictional cognate of Africa. I wanted to explore what it would be like if a different culture developed their own version of steam society, not sort of just copying what the Europeans did. So I'm treating colonialism in terms of not just politically, but also scientifically, and in the attitudes of the engineers who are building these things. Having seen, you know, the Western ships, and some of them having worked on them, but trying to figure out their own way of doing things, and it's been an interesting challenge. You know, one of the things that happens is I end up with a wooden steam engine, if you believe it.
I have a tendency to be more of the action part of steampunk. I do have wonderful magical creations in my stories, but I don't really worry that much about it being actually steampunk. And I especially have not really worried about the punk part. And they're all in the 1870s in New York City mostly. So it's not the American West, but it is still Victorian.
You know, the funny thing about this genre that it's one of those genres you think you know what is about, but you really don't.
For me, anyway, the entire Victorian era, to me, is steampunk. But there's so many other subgenres of steampunk, like clock punk, diesel punk, gas lamp fantasy, and other things like that. It's such a versatile genre, and you can combine it with so many other genres like fantasy or horror or whatever. And I've even seen some steampunk that takes place in outer space. Defining it is very, very difficult, I would say.
Nice.
But I think that might be a feature, not a bug. I spoke earlier about the hopefulness of the modern era and the belief that our inventions could solve problems. I think that's the one thing that kind of carries through everywhere. That's why we see so many mad scientists or so many crazy clockwork inventors or so many adventurers that have gadgets on their belt that will help them do things. That idea of the combination of something that we've invented plus man's ingenuity is central to pretty much every story that's there. And I think that has a huge impact on the genre, which is partly what separates it out from other types of fantasy or science fiction, partially because the types of things that we're inventing and the types of things we're using are really on a more mechanical level. and therefore have moving bits, moving cogs and bits and things that can break down instantly and fail and do things in a way. The only other genre that I think that really has that same reliance on the tech is hard science fiction, where if anything goes wrong on the spaceship, that throws everything in things. And so science fiction there really comes into steampunk in the way we look at our mechanical issues.
Yeah, if you look at some of the 50s and early 60s pulp science fiction, there's a lot of similarity in some of the aesthetic to steampunk. The idea of these wild and crazy, not terribly sensible inventions and weird-looking spaceships and things that are easily translatable into airships and electric guns and the kind of things that people use in steampunk. I like the idea that it's the hopefulness that we can solve our problems with if we're just ingenious enough. I think that's a key. It's certainly a key in the way I write the story, that the inventions are meant to solve problems, not create more problems. It's not dark fantasy where immediately every invention gets turned towards evil.
Tech generally takes more of a backstage with my stuff. Boston Metaphysical is a good mix of supernatural and fantasy. Yeah, I guess I take a little bit different. I delve a lot into politics in what I write, and the themes that I usually deal with almost all the time are classism, sexism, and racism. That's why I always kind of qualify. It really depends on who I'm talking to. If it's a steampunk crowd, I'm going to market, here, this is a steampunk thing. If I'm talking to a crowd that is not familiar with steampunk or is, not too warm to it, I will spin it as alternate history.
Well, one thing I've had a lot of fun with in my stuff is a lot of interesting bits of research have come out of it, things that I had never heard of before that I can work into my stories because they're the right time period, and I can imagine a reason why I would have done that with my characters. Like the fact that there was a hoax in the 1870s with a big newspaper banner in New York City that all of the animals had escaped from the Central Park Menagerie and were running wild in the streets. Well, the fiercely formidable fugitive explains why that hoax was created and what actually happened at the menagerie that day that they needed to cover up.
This genre in specific, I think, has an attitude. It has a visual element that, the fashion, the invention, the tech, it all has this kind of fun attitude to it, and I think that's what makes this unique. What are some of the elements that you feel if you are staying true to a steampunk lore or you're writing a steampunk, that you have to incorporate in what you're writing?
I think science in some form needs to be there. Some sort of Socratic engagement with ideas, really, because again, steampunk is all about solving problems. And so even in Madeleine's book and her metaphysical book, her books are still all about solving problems, which is great, by the way she goes about that. But I think that's one of the things that really is a hallmark. And I see that as well when I go to conventions and I meet so many fans in amazing costumes. And when they're explaining to me why they're wearing what they're wearing, why they have this gadget or that gadget, it's always from a standpoint of, oh, well, this is going to help me do this, or this creates that. And so it's very much focused on that problem solving center, and then the fashion grows out of that. So why do so many women in steampunk wear trousers with corsets? Well, because in real history, women wore very restrictive, heavy layers of petticoats and skirts. and then the corsets, and then jackets over the top of that. And so their movement was restricted. And so steampunk solves that by still getting the fun look of the corset, but putting the women in trousers so they can run around and be more free.
Yeah, I completely agree with Eddie Louise. I have a lot of fun with the costuming and the fashion in the world I've created, which is antithetical to my own personal how I dress, for the gym, like every day. But it's that whole other creative side, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. For me, it's the characters I really like. Like the mad inventors and whatnot and stuff like that. But also playing with the history. That really is what attracts me to the steampunk.
I had to come up with a reason why the for the goggles. Sort of using the inventions, and then, okay, what do we need to do to get to these inventions, and what kind of safety equipment are they going to have at that particular time? Well, the goggles, especially when they're flying early airships that aren't enclosed, they need them to be able to see in the cold. I think that the feel of the fashion and the setting, the way the way the streets are lit, the way that there's a mix of technologies and levels of technologies. My main inventor happens to be a woman who's an artist, and she falls in love with the steam engine and dumps her boyfriend for the steam engine. And then she continues forward from there. But the sort of the feel of the world is really important.
Well, I just let the characters kind of tell me who they are. The heroine in the Conman Chronicles is very much a woman of the 1990s up instead of the 1870s, but she has her own mind. She knows how to do it, what she wants to do with it. She is the problem solver without being the scientist in the group. She's always worried that she is the least intelligent of the batch, but she's the only one who has any common sense at all. And so that was fun to play with.
Yeah, with my short stories, I tend to go more for the quirky characters, I think.
Nice.
Because I've got the professor who's the steampunk Ghostbuster, and got the consulting detective who hates Sherlock Holmes, and stuff like that. With the novels, though, I tend to go more on the dark side, and I'm exploring some of the underbelly of the steampunk world. So yeah, there's two different things that are going on with my writing.
Yeah, all of my stuff is dark. Eddie Louise will tell you that. All of my stuff is dark. But yeah, in the original 6-issue graphic novel miniseries, I have some pretty classic characters in there. I have an ex-Pinkerton detective. Pinkerton is like all over the place when it comes to steampunk. I have a genius scientist who is actually based on a historical figure. And probably the one that's a bit of an outlier is the woman, Caitlin O'Sullivan, who is a psychic, because she's a medium and a spirit photographer. And she comes from lower class Irish. But together they come up with the solution they need to solve the problem.
My character came from a rather different place. I resented the fact that there were no mad female scientists in general popular culture that didn't begin as evil. Dr. Frankenstein was not evil. He was a scientist obsessed. Dr. Jekyll was not evil. He was a scientist obsessed. And on and on. We have all these examples of male scientists that get too obsessed in their research and bad things happen because of it. But for women, if they're going to be mad scientists, then we start them at the place of already being evil in the vast majority of comic books and film things. So I wanted to write a female mad scientist, and I wanted her to start from a scientific spot. Now, this is something else that steampunk wholeheartedly does. We rewrite history to allow women a voice where they didn't have one, to give them an agency where it was restricted in real life. So I imagined a major university with research grants, and the way it worked in the Victorian era was that you had to create science, on a grant. You had to create science that was worthy of the scientific society. And then those scientific societies would give it the rubber stamp, and then that's how you'd get more grants. And so I wanted to write a woman who was doing science for that. And I took galvanism, which is the amazing science of electricity and the effect on the human body. And we all know that from Frankenstein, and we think of it as crazy science. But in reality, that's the background science, the true science that led to the MRI and the EKG and things that we take for granted now, the X-ray. All of that came out of galvanism. So I started with the lady galvanist and applied a lot of electricity to see what would happen.
Does steampunk come first, or is it the characters and the world that you're building around them, or do you set out to make sure you're writing steampunk?
In my case, it had to be steampunk because I had to have a woman with a major university grant and laboratory access in 1893. And there just was no such thing. Even Marie Curie, who was doing science at that time, who now she's one of the few of the era that we give credit for her own work. She was working in her husband's laboratory, and there were times she wasn't allowed to do the work. So for me, it had to be steampunk because I had to have a world where a woman could do the work.
You get to play a little bit with the society when you're in steampunk. One of the things I did is have the Europeans get booted out of the continent that we call North America. It's rather sort of scarred their psyches. So the colonialism is different. They treat Africa differently. But what I also do is look at what are different reasons that people invent things. There's one person who invents things because this is her creativity coming to the fore. She can't help but think up new inventions. There's other people who are we need to stay ahead of this evil empire. So we need to develop this and this and this, and they go about it in very much like Edison's invention factory. And then you have people who are trying to re-engineer something that they've seen and come up with their own version of it, but they don't have all the tools and the manufacturing background and support to do it. So they have to come up with something completely crazy to do it their own way. And I'm looking forward to the next book because I get to make a couple of the main characters get into a real clash about how and why they're inventing things because their styles are very different.
For me, it's generally the story dictates whether it's going to be steampunk or not, or whether it's going to be straight historical fantasy. I mean, if the story needs to be a little more flexible or a little more outlandish, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but yeah, then I'll go steampunk with it. Like with my short story, The Professor's Christmas Ghost, I needed a Ghostbuster in the Victorian era, so it was just perfect for steampunk.
Yeah, for Boston Metaphysical, the journey was different. It was originally a TV pilot that I wrote while I was at UCLA Film School, and it wasn't steampunk. It was originally called 1900 Detective Agency, and I wanted to set essentially a Mulder and Scully type of pairing, but without the backing of the FBI, but with just what was available to them at that time. And a friend of mine suggested that this would be a good thing to develop in a steampunk world. And after I'd heard of it, didn't know a lot about it, did some research and completely agreed with them. So then I redeveloped the story and brought those characters into it. And it just happened that they fit.
I have a tendency to worry about the characters and their found family more than whether or not everything is strictly steampunk. The genre has a set time frame which has so many forgotten women that it's been fun to pull them in. In the last book in the series so far, is set in Ireland, and my next door neighbor put me in touch with the head of the Irish consulate here in Austin, and he gave me some tips and suggested that there was a woman scientist at that time, the Lady Rossi, who might be interesting to put into the book. And it turned out that she was perfect as someone who would teach the heroine photography, because that was one of the things she did. She also was a blacksmith, built a telescope that they have recently rebuilt in the Irish countryside. All the while she was married to a lord, and so that she could be funded for this sort of thing. But she's a fascinating woman, and I had never heard of her, and I bet a lot of people had never heard of her. But bringing her into the world and back to life a little bit was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had the same experience with Granville Woods, who's he's my genius scientist. He's African American gentleman who got lost in American history, and in my research in putting together my team, I found him, and he, was in that period. He did work with Bell, and he actually sued Edison for stealing some of his patents, and he won.
Nice.
Yeah. Actually, Edison offered him a job, which he refused wisely, and started a company with his brother in upstate New York. So it's a lot of, women and people of color, as we know, get lost in history because they're not the ones writing the history. Mm-hmm. And it's always great when you can find them and introduce the world to them again.
All right, so let's talk a little bit, just real quickly, about the fandom of steampunk.
Well, one of the things I experienced, I was at a Comic-Con with my steampunk books, and all these people walking by in these fantastic steampunk costumes. But only about half of them actually read steampunk. They just loved the aesthetic of the gears and the pipes and the goggles and everything. They just fell in love with the look. And then I could tell them, if you look like this, then you might like this book, which is sort of where some of this comes from. And then you've got the ones who are serious steampunk readers who will read your book and argue with you whether, it's this or that or the other thing. And that's fun in its own way, too.
Yeah, I've kind of have the advantage of I started in comics. And so I had to pitch my story to people who weren't necessarily into steampunk or even historical fiction. But I had wonderful artists, and they seemed to like the story. And I can't tell you how many times people have read the graphic novels, enjoyed them, and said, I don't like steampunk, but I like yours. And I'm going like, well, it kind of is. So maybe you should try some other things. And I think they did, but I was able to bring people in who wouldn't necessarily have looked at it before, because I was addressing comics people who were interested in the comic and the look, and then got hooked into the story. And then later on, expanded, their world.
Do you all feel like this is important to tell these stories because history doesn't?
Yeah.
Yes, wholeheartedly. Also, as Madeline and other authors here have mentioned, the fact that we're bringing in multicultural steampunk now and is critical, because we have a tendency to imagine our world exactly as we see it. And currently, thanks to Hollywood, we see that as 75% male and 90% white. Yeah. And they've done studies that even in other countries, even in Africa, for example, when they imagine a certain sort of thing, they're going to imagine it 75% male and 90% white, even though that's not their own culture, but that's what they see in the media, and that's what they see in the movie. And that's bad. So steampunk is a way of us to take this thing that we know is history and broaden it, bring back those people, bring more women into prominence, bring more people of color into prominence, and say, wait a minute, the world is a lot more varied, and maybe that can help us like break that bad image we have from our digital media.